مندي حمام الدوح يا حمام الدوح غر الطربة واشد ما شئت حجازا وصبا وهب الدهر لنا لذته وهب الدهر لنا لذته وهب الدهر لنا لذته واسترد الدهر ما قد وهب واسترد الدهر ما قد وهب أفندم ماما
The word maqam in Arabic comes from the verb qama, which is to stand or to be in a place. Maqam is the place where one stands. To understand the origin and the genesis of Two Rivers, there's a history that predates it, and my own personal history. There's obviously also musical worlds that are combining that I've had access to or connections to. So in terms of my own story, it really starts with my first musical training. Before I even played an instrument, I was singing in church choirs in the Chicago area. Yeah, I was actually went to a Lutheran school. People often assume that, my Iraqi father must have introduced me to Iraqi Maqam, because that's the music. He actually grew up during the golden age of Maqam music in Iraq, but he was so intent on leaving that world that by the time he immigrated first to England and then to the United States, he was very interested in Western culture and mostly interested in jazz and blues, and Louis Armstrong was my father's hero. And the first music that I heard growing up was actually Porgy and Bess, Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. And the sound of Louis Armstrong's trumpet was ingrained in me it's a pre-verbal memory, like from when I was 2 or 3 years old. So my father was kind of bringing me in the path of jazz and blues, and one time he took me to the Checkerboard Lounge. I actually have a photo from that. When I was 13 years old, he took me to the Checkerboard Lounge, which is an old blues club in Chicago. But I didn't hear any Iraqi Maqam from him. I found it through my own research and my own digging. So Chicago is unique musically for a lot of things, but the two areas that I really connected with were the blues scene, and I was working in my college years, I was working with the Chicago Blues Band, and we had like a regular Sunday night gig at a club called the Lion's Den. We had a Wednesday night gig at another club called the Key Wester in the suburb. We had I was playing 3 or 4 times a week with a blues band in Chicago. But at the same time, I had a double life as a classical trumpet player. So I was playing in the Civic Orchestra of Chicago and studying with the Chicago Symphony musicians. And Chicago Symphony is known worldwide for its brass section. Like the Chicago brass is like the hallmark or the sort of defining orchestral brass section of the world. And there was one man in particular named Bud Herseth, who was in his 50th year as principal trumpeter of the Chicago Symphony. And I had a chance to study with him for 2 years. I was having like almost weekly lessons. And then later I was in a workshop with him for 4 weeks, like 3 hours a day, getting this really intensive, direct orchestral classical trumpet training. And I again, I don't think I knew how lucky I was at the time. In one way, I always knew I wasn't going to be an orchestral trumpet player. I was not cut out to be like this I'm not a consistent enough person to play the same thing the same way every time and follow instructions and play exactly what's on the score. I always was messing up and it wasn't a good context for me. But I couldn't deny that the experience of studying with Bud Herseth and then another trumpet player in the Chicago Symphony, Mark Ridenauer, and the experience of playing in an orchestral brass section, there's nothing quite like it. It's like being inside of a church organ, where you're one of the pipes and there's like 15 more pipes around you, and it's just huge and glorious sound. And that was another thing that when I got into Maqam, as much as I love everything about Maqam, it's something that's like, wow, I miss that. I miss that, like, big, enormous, gigantic sound. And I think that's why later I had to have the Rivers of Sound Orchestra as a way to kind of reproduce and still feel that big ecstasy, yeah. Basically, I arrived to New York in spring of 2000, and I wanted to understand what's my contribution as, there was so many different jazz scenes, some very, very avant-garde, free improvisation, some very, very highly structured, complex odd meters, people improvising on 12-tone rows, and there was so many different things, and the scene was very compartmentalized at that time. There wasn't a lot of intermingling, and I was trying to figure out where I fit, and so my friends at the time were Rudresh Mahanthapa and Vijay Iyer and Elliot Kavi and a few others that were kind of traversing different musical worlds that started to make sense and really resonate with me, in the sense that they were connecting with non-Western music of their heritage, and also exploring jazz as more of a research or an exploration musically and psychologically and cognitively, like not just forms, pre-existing forms, like take a swing rhythm and combine it with this. It was almost definitely questioning at each stage, what is the origin of this rhythmic element, or what is this harmonic piece, and how does it relate to other pieces. So when I heard how Vijay and Rudresh in particular were relating to Carnatic South Indian music, and how they were integrating that into their creative expression, that was a key for me, and sort of a moment when I realized that maybe it was time for me to explore Iraqi music and Arab traditional music and start to know what is maqam, and that kind of set me on a path, and played my first gig in New York at a Moroccan restaurant called Tajin on September 10th, 2001, and I was in total ecstasy after that night, and we had such a beautiful time playing, and the audience and the poetry and the dancing and the music and the food afterward, and it was like this wonderful feast. And I went home, and then the next morning Rudresh called me and said, turn on your television, and I looked, and there was the Twin Towers going up in smoke, and that kind of 9/11 was the defining moment for the 21st century, I think, but also in my own life, because then it kind of situated me as an Arab or Iraqi American living in New York, not just another immigrant culture. So it also coincided with my deep research into maqam. A month later, I entered a trumpet competition, the Carmine Caruso trumpet competition. I won, got a $10,000 check, and basically used that money to travel, and went via Morocco and Tunisia, but went to Iraq, and that was early 2002, and basically spent the next 5 years studying maqam.
Take some food first. It's not fair.
What nation does food come from? Or is it regional in all over?
Yeah, like basically the Levant area, if you should use that term, the Syria, Lebanon, Palestine.
Oh, I see, so it's
It's
not.
just, and also it's not classical or like Nasheed, he makes the blood, move. You know, the rhythms and even the intensity, it's amazing.
Well, I don't have any responsibilities as these guys do. I can float on top of whatever else is going on. My main concern is the pitch.
Maybe I'd heard a little bit, but I definitely hadn't played any of like the Georgina and the Foundation. That was all new for me.
I think the biggest thing for me at first was trying to understand the quarter tones, which I'm still trying to navigate. The Maqam, really, like each different scale and stuff.
It's not something that I get to try out anywhere else except in this band. I mean, I never get to do that, so it's just really.
Yo, did you try some of the crispy rice?
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, we got some of that.
Can I put some?
I had it for breakfast.
just starting to study Arabic music in early 2001, then I found there was a whole other community of Arab musicians that I connected to and actually felt very welcome. And I was bringing my trumpet and trying to integrate the trumpet, which is not a traditional instrument, and bring it into the Arabic music vocabulary. The trumpet has 3 piston valves, and each of these valves is designed to lower the pitch or change the pitch by a half tone or semitone. This is the smallest unit found in Western music. So this would correspond with the white and the black keys of the piano. 12 equal steps make an octave. Maqam music, that's the music of Iraq, the music of the Arab world, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and beyond, uses intervals that don't fit into the equal tempered system. They're much subtler and very, very specific. So basically, when I wanted to integrate the trumpet into maqam music, I needed to come up with new techniques to be able to play those microtones. And it depends on these slides, because every trumpet is built with a slide that's connected to the 3rd valve and it's connected to the 1st valve. And those are meant, the purpose of these slides is to correct the tuning. There's some natural acoustic stuff that goes on with the trumpet where certain notes are a little bit sharp or a little bit flat. But what I learned one day through exploration was that these could also be used to find these microtones, to be able to accurately produce them. So I'll give an example so you can kind of hear, and then this would be a scale, the first 5 notes of a scale, like the minor scale in Western music. So now if I wanted to change the 2nd degree, I have an option of making it a half step lower. That becomes a Western mode called Phrygian. But if I want to play something in between, which is found in Arabic music, the trumpet doesn't naturally lend itself to those notes. So that's when I had to come up with a new fingering. So that 2nd note, if you can tune in your ear, that would be a Western tuning. This is. Just in musical terms, the word maqam refers to a system of modes. And these modes are kind of like scales, but they have melodies that go along with them. And they're usually 7 notes in the mode. And there's kind of 7 main modes, and then from them they branch out, and there's all these different sub-maqams and sub-phrases that exist. But basically, maqam as a modal system, and this is a musical system that's found from Morocco and Tunisia, Algeria, all of North Africa, throughout the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and Central Asia, as far east as China. Also Southern European music, like from Southern Italy. Flamenco music also has elements of maqam. So it's a really significant part of the world that uses maqam musical language. So basically, this is another case where there's like, okay, yes, there's these distinct musical traditions, but when you trace things back further and further to the origin, and you go back a few thousand years, you find that we're actually coming from kind of the same musical principles. Did humans originate it, or is it the physics of sound manifesting themselves through us? My main teacher during my years of studying maqam was Amir Saadi, who is renowned and known for being the only person alive today who knows the entire Iraqi Baghdadi Maqam tradition. So we're talking about roughly 60 maqamat that all have inside of them many variations and many different ways of performing them, that in order for one to be considered a master, they really should understand all of them. Plus there's a whole repertoire of songs that are called pestat that are connected to the maqam tradition, and there's literally hundreds if not thousands of these pestat. And Hamid was the one person I found who knew all of this information. I kept finding people that could tell me a little bit here and there, and would say, well, and I'd ask them, what is this maqam I read about? And, oh, don't worry about that, nobody performs that one anymore. I'm like, okay, but why is it mentioned in this book if it's not so important? I go to Hamid and say, okay, what is, maqam nadi? I was like, what? No one ever taught. He'd sing it for me. And, okay, this is the version from 1920s. This is the version from the late 1800s. This is how it became in the 1950s. Hamid had so many rich understanding of all the complexities of maqam, and he knew how to teach it, which is also very rare in oral traditions, because often it's just, you just sort of live around this music all your life, and it just, by osmosis it becomes part of you, and you ask the right questions. But I didn't have a life of living in Baghdad surrounded by maqam performers. So Hamid was like my direct, through him was my connection to this centuries of masters that he was connected to. And I often think of the analogy of a candle, like it just takes one candle connecting to another, and for a fire to be passed on. You don't have to have the whole burning bush or whatever, it's just through a candle. And I really feel like that was my way of connecting to him. And also what, like in Zen Buddhism they call heart-to-heart transmission. It was through spending time with him, through becoming deeply connected to him as a human being, that I was able to absorb and let maqam become part of who I am. Not just learn it as an intellectual or musical exploration, but it changed me as a human being. the other important element is that, this goes again to Vijay. One day he called me and said, hey, there's this workshop that Cecil Taylor is leading at Turtle Bay Music School. It's a month-long workshop. I highly recommend you do it. I just remember his words. He said it's a microcosm of society that Cecil has created. And I was kind of like, what is that? You know, like when you've studied jazz as a sort of a, you know, these are the notes, these are the modes, these are the scales, this is the how to play tunes, and you've studied classical music, when some, you know, microcosm of society, like it's a, you know, it wasn't even thinking of music socially in that way before. He was creating this environment that was so open and so inclusive and so accepting of whatever happens. And I, through that, started to understand this idea of a microcosm of society, that inside the ensemble, leaders were emerging, passive people, some people quit, couldn't deal with it. Some people became the studious ones, like the scribe that writes everything down, and what did the master say, and then whatever they wrote yesterday is irrelevant the next day. And then there were people going with the flow, and it was so much different stuff happening. But that first performance at the Turtle Bay Music School was a revelation for me. And I remember I went up to him afterward, and I said, Cecil, thank you so much. I probably called him Mr. Taylor. And I said, I'll never be the same. And then he sang the standard. He said, I'll never be the same. He sang it back to me. And I gave him my phone number, and then invited me to be part of an ensemble that he was leading. It was with the Sound Vision Orchestra based out of, you know, New York and Boston. And the first gig we did was 35 musicians at the Knitting Factory. And eventually that group got smaller and smaller to the point that there were 14 of us. We played in Macedonia, Macedonian Jazz Festival, and we did like these week-long runs at the Iridium. We did like 5 or 6 runs where we would do like 2 or 3 shows a night. But why is this story with Cecil significant, other than the fact that like he's just one of the most extraordinary human beings I ever encountered, was the fact that I was playing with Cecil between 2001 and 2006, and that was exactly the period that I was also studying Maqam in Iraq. So I was basically between these two vastly different musical worlds. So Maqam for me at that time meant going to the master, but my lessons with Hamid were like him singing this piece and me spending days and days listening and trying to copy every slight detail and every nuance and how many times he vibrates on this note before he goes to the next note, and learning Maqam in a very structured and specific way, because in Maqam Iraqi there's a right way to do things, and then, or there's many right ways, but there's also, you can just go off the phrase a little tiny bit and you've lost it. So Maqam Iraqi was very, very strict and very, very specific, and I'd spend like, first of all in Iraq and then later in other places with other teachers, and I get an email, hey Cecil, we got a gig with Cecil's band at the Iridium next month, can you come? Okay. So I'd like suddenly take myself out of this Maqam environment where I was mostly singing and learning santur, and then I was on stage with Cecil with, you know, like 14 or 18 musicians, and the music was like explosive, and anything is possible. So those were the two musical worlds that I was traversing right up to 2006 when I wrote my first piece, which was entitled Two Rivers. I've been traveling in the Middle East and having this back and forth between the world of Cecil Taylor and the world of Maqam for 5 years. And then I returned to the US to make an album of traditional Iraqi Maqam. During that time, I got an invitation from Lenny Seidman, the director of the Painted Bride, which is an art center in Philadelphia, to compose a new piece combining jazz and Maqam. And I had in my ear at the time the music of Cecil and the music of Maqam, and kind of was imagining a large ensemble, something very expressive and a wide palette of sounds. But then the amount of the commission was like barely enough for me to put together a six-piece band. So I basically went with the musicians that I knew and had worked with. So Rudresh Mahantapa, who I mentioned earlier, alto saxophonist and very close friend of mine. And then Carlo De Rosa, who was the first bassist that I played with when I moved to New York. And he was part of the scene that I was hanging out with in my early years in New York, and felt very comfortable with him. He's a tremendous musician. Nasheet Waits, the first drummer that I played with when I moved to New York in 2000, that was kind of representing the jazz side. Now on the Maqam side, I was looking for musicians that could play Maqam music but weren't stuck in that in just being Maqam musicians. I wanted people with a little bit more wider horizons, and sort of maybe had experience with other styles of music. So I had been working with some very Arabic musicians in New York, but the first one who occurred to me was Tariq Abushi, plays Buzuq, because he was also studying piano, jazz piano at William Patterson, and was actually a very, very good and accomplished piano player, had classical and jazz background. So it was sort of a natural thing that he would be in the ensemble, because he could understand the world of jazz and the world of Maqam. And then Zafar Tawil, who at that time was mostly playing in traditional context, but he plays oud, qanun, percussion, violin, nai, any instrument you put in his hands, he'll make music out of. And because of that versatility and open-mindedness, I knew he would be a great fit. So basically those were the 5 musicians, and they were all available on March 26, 2006 to play at the Painted Bride in Philadelphia. So my relationship with Rudresh, we were and are still very, very good friends, but was becoming a little bit tricky because first of all, he was getting to be very successful and he was touring all the time with his band, so he couldn't do half the gigs that I had lined up. And so we mutually decided, that he would leave the project. And then I heard about a guy named Ule Matisen, and he was a microtonal genius. He could play pretty much any frequency on the saxophone, not just quarter tones, any sound. And because my music at that time, I was working with maybe 48 tones per octave or more, Ule was 100% on board. First rehearsal, he and I got together, we played a duo, and he could play everything that I wrote. He could play it better than I could. So he joined as the tenor saxophonist in 2010 for the Inanna project.